They said grief had driven her mad. They watched from their porches and through their curtains as the widow poured that strange, foul-smelling liquid into every piece of wood she could find, muttering to herself, working alone except for her small daughter and an old dog who never left her side. They laughed at the waste of time and money, at the peculiar rituals of a woman who clearly didn't understand how the world worked anymore. But when winter came with a fury no one had predicted, when the cold turned vicious and survival became uncertain, that strange liquid became the difference between warmth and freezing, between life and death. And the woman they had mocked became the only one who truly understood what was coming. Her name was Margaret, though the town of Riverside simply called her the Widow, after her husband Thomas died in a logging accident the previous spring. She was 34 years old but looked older, worn down by grief and the weight of sudden responsibility. Her daughter Emily was 8, quiet and watchful, with her father's dark hair and her mother's serious eyes. Their dog, an aging golden retriever named Copper, moved slowly now, his muzzle gray, but his loyalty absolute. Thomas had left them the house, a modest 2-story structure on the edge of town, and a small savings account that Margaret knew wouldn't last through winter if she wasn't careful. He had also left her with knowledge, years of conversations about timber and weather and the old ways of preparing for harsh seasons. Margaret had listened to those conversations more carefully than Thomas ever realized, storing away information she never thought she'd need to use alone. If you're enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The summer after Thomas died was brutal for Margaret. She took work where she could find it, cleaning houses, doing laundry, mending clothes, anything that allowed her to keep Emily close and still earn enough to buy food. The townspeople were kind in the distant way small towns often are, offering casseroles and sympathetic looks, but rarely practical help. They assumed she would sell the house and move somewhere cheaper, maybe back to her family in another state. They assumed she couldn't make it on her own. But Margaret had no intention of leaving. This house held every memory of Thomas, every moment of their life together. Emily had been born in the bedroom upstairs. Copper had been a puppy here. The garden in the back had been planted by Thomas's own hands. Leaving would mean abandoning all of that, and Margaret wasn't ready. She would never be ready. As summer turned to autumn, Margaret began to notice things. The way the squirrels were gathering nuts earlier than usual, storing them in greater quantities. The way the birds migrated sooner, in larger flocks. The way Copper would stand on the porch in the evening, nose to the wind, ears back, sensing something Margaret couldn't quite name. And she remembered Thomas's words from the autumn before he died, words spoken casually over coffee one morning. When the animals know something we don't, it's time to pay attention. Margaret started paying attention. She watched the sky, noting the strange color it took on at sunset, the heaviness in the air. She listened to the old-timers at the general store talk about their aches and pains, about how their joints were predicting weather more accurately than any forecast. She heard the concern in their voices when they mentioned that the Farmer's Almanac was predicting a harsh winter, possibly the worst in decades. Most people dismissed such predictions. Weather forecasts on television were calling for a normal winter, maybe slightly colder than average. Modern meteorology had replaced folk wisdom, and people trusted their screens more than they trusted the land. But Margaret trusted what she saw, what she felt, what the animals were telling her, and she began to prepare. She started with firewood. Thomas had always cut and stacked wood for winter, but he had died before completing that task. Margaret borrowed a chainsaw from a neighbor, claiming she just needed to clean up some fallen branches. She spent weeks cutting, splitting, and stacking wood, working until her hands blistered and her back ached. Emily helped, carrying small pieces, stacking them carefully where her mother directed. Copper lay in the shade nearby, watching over them both. The neighbors noticed, of course. They noticed everything. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 2 houses down, mentioned to her husband that Margaret was overdoing it, that she was gathering enough wood to heat 3 houses. Mr. Chen at the hardware store commented to customers that the widow was buying supplies like she was preparing for the apocalypse. Young couples walking by would see Margaret working and shake their heads, whispering about how grief made people behave strangely. But the real mockery began when Margaret started with the liquid. She had found the recipe in one of Thomas's old notebooks, tucked away in the shed with his tools and materials. It was written in his careful handwriting, labeled simply, "Grandfather's Wood Treatment for Extreme Cold." The recipe was old, passed down through generations of loggers and woodsmen, a mixture that Thomas's grandfather had sworn by, but that Thomas himself had never needed to use in their relatively mild winters. Margaret read the recipe carefully, her finger tracing Thomas's handwriting, feeling close to him through these words he had written. The ingredients seemed strange: linseed oil, turpentine, pine tar, beeswax, and something Thomas had simply called old diesel, used motor oil that had been filtered and aged. The instructions were specific: heat the mixture slowly, never letting it boil, stirring constantly until the wax dissolved completely. Then let it cool and age for 3 days before application. She gathered the ingredients slowly, buying what she could afford when she could afford it. The linseed oil came from the hardware store. The turpentine and pine tar she ordered online with money she should have used for groceries. The beeswax she got from a local beekeeper in exchange for helping him process honey one weekend. The old diesel she drained from Thomas's truck, which still sat in the garage, too precious to sell, too painful to drive. Making the mixture was difficult. Margaret set up a propane burner in the backyard, using an old pot she no longer needed for cooking. She heated the oils slowly, carefully, adding ingredients in the order Thomas's notes specified. The smell was terrible, acrid, chemical, with undertones of pine and something darker. It made her eyes water and her stomach turn. Emily retreated into the house, closing windows against the odor. Copper moved upwind, sneezing occasionally but staying loyal to his post. The neighbors smelled it immediately. The odor carried on the autumn breeze, thick and unpleasant, settling over the surrounding houses like an invisible fog. Complaints began within hours. Mrs. Patterson called the police, claiming someone was burning toxic waste. Mr. Chen stopped by, asking Margaret what in God's name she was doing. A young mother from down the street appeared with her baby, demanding to know if Margaret was manufacturing drugs. Margaret explained calmly, over and over, that she was making a wood treatment, something her late husband's grandfather used to use. But the explanation sounded absurd even to her own ears. Who treated wood with homemade concoctions in this day and age? Who spent money on such things when you could buy commercial products at any store? The mockery grew louder when Margaret began applying the mixture to wood. She started with the firewood, painting each piece with careful strokes, coating it thoroughly with the dark, viscous liquid. Then she moved to the exterior of the house, treating the wooden siding, the window frames, the porch boards. She worked methodically, covering every exposed piece of wood she could reach with the strange mixture that glistened wetly and smelled like a combination of a mechanic's shop and a pine forest. The neighbors watched with expressions ranging from pity to contempt. They saw a widow wasting her limited resources on folk remedies and superstition. They saw a woman who had clearly lost her grip on reality after her husband's death. They saw someone who didn't understand that modern materials and methods had made such primitive treatments obsolete. "She's lost her mind," Mrs. Patterson told anyone who would listen. "That poor child, living with a mother who's clearly unstable." "It's the grief," Mr. Chen said with practiced sympathy. "Makes people do strange things. She'll come to her senses eventually." "Someone should check on that little girl," the young mother said, bouncing her baby on her hip. "Living in a house that smells like a chemical plant can't be healthy." But no one actually intervened. They talked, they judged, they shook their heads, but they didn't help. Because helping would mean getting involved. And getting involved with someone who seemed unstable was more trouble than most people wanted to take on. Margaret heard the whispers. She saw the looks. She knew what they thought of her. But she continued anyway, driven by something stronger than the desire for social acceptance. She was driven by memory, by Thomas's voice in her head, telling her to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. She was driven by the responsibility of keeping Emily safe, of honoring her husband's knowledge, of trusting what she observed in nature over what others assured her was normal. As October turned to November, Margaret expanded her preparations. She weather-stripped every door and window in the house, using materials she bought with money from selling some of her jewelry. She insulated the attic with batting she got on clearance, climbing up there herself and working in the stifling heat and dust. She checked the chimney, cleaning it herself with brushes and determination, making sure it would draw properly when the fires needed to burn day and night. She bought food in bulk when she found sales, filling her pantry and freezer with staples that would last. She tested the generator Thomas had bought years ago, making sure it ran, buying fuel stabilizer, and storing extra gasoline in approved containers in the shed. She checked their winter clothes, mending what she could, buying what she absolutely had to at thrift stores, making sure Emily had warm boots that fit and a coat that would protect her from serious cold. Every action was deliberate. Every purchase calculated. Every hour of work another brick in the wall she was building against a winter she felt coming with increasing certainty. And every action brought more judgment, more mockery, more head-shaking from neighbors who thought they knew better. Emily watched her mother work with the quiet understanding of a child who has already learned that life is unpredictable, and safety is something you build yourself. She helped where she could, never complaining about the odd smell that clung to everything, never questioning why they were doing things differently than other families. She trusted her mother with the absolute faith that children have before the world teaches them doubt. Copper stayed close to both of them, his presence a comfort and a reminder of Thomas. The old dog seemed to understand what Margaret was doing, or perhaps he simply sensed her determination and matched it with his own loyalty. He slept on Emily's bed at night, a warm, breathing guardian against fears and nightmares. He followed Margaret during the day, lying nearby while she worked, occasionally lifting his head to check on her, then settling back down with a sigh that seemed to say, "I'm here. I won't leave." By late November, Margaret had done everything she could think to do. The house was as ready as she could make it. The wood was treated and stacked. The supplies were gathered. The generator was tested and ready. She had even filled extra containers with water, storing them in the basement, remembering Thomas mentioning once that in extreme cold, pipes could freeze despite best efforts. She stood in her backyard one evening, looking at the wood stacked high and treated with the strange liquid that had caused so much mockery. In the fading light, the wood gleamed slightly, the treatment having soaked in and dried to a dark, almost waxy finish. It looked different from untreated wood, waterproof and somehow denser, as if it had been transformed into something more than simple timber. Margaret reached out and touched a piece, feeling the smooth, slightly tacky surface. She thought of Thomas's grandfather, of all the winters he must have survived using this recipe. She thought of Thomas himself, of the knowledge he had carried and passed on, even if he hadn't known how desperately she would need it. And she felt, for the first time since his death, that she was doing exactly what she needed to do. Emily came out to stand beside her, small hand slipping into Margaret's larger one. "Is it enough, Mama?" she asked quietly. Margaret looked down at her daughter, at the trust in those young eyes, at the hope that still lived despite everything they had lost. "I think so, sweetheart," she said. "I really think so." Copper joined them, leaning against Margaret's leg, warm and solid. The three of them stood together in the gathering darkness, looking at the preparations that had cost so much in money and labor and social standing. And Margaret felt a calm certainty settle over her, a knowledge that whatever was coming, they would face it together, and they would survive. The first snow came in early December, earlier than usual, a light dusting that melted by noon but left a chill in the air that didn't dissipate. The weather forecast still predicted a normal winter, but the old-timers were less certain. They gathered at the general store, talking in low voices about signs and portents, about winters they remembered from their youth, about the feeling in their bones that something different was approaching. Margaret listened when she went to buy supplies, filing away their comments, noting their concerns. They treated her with more respect than the younger residents did, perhaps because they recognized in her preparations an echo of their own younger years, when people relied less on systems and more on their own foresight. "You getting ready for a hard one?" old Mr. Jameson asked her one afternoon, his eyes sharp despite his 80-plus years. "Yes, sir," Margaret replied simply. "I think it's coming." He nodded slowly, studying her face. "Your husband was Thomas Webb, wasn't he? Good man. Smart about the woods, about weather. He teach you things?" "He did," Margaret said, her throat tightening at the memory. "Then you listen to what you learned," Mr. Jameson said firmly. "Young folks today, they trust their screens more than their senses. But the screens don't know everything. The earth knows, the animals know. And if you're paying attention, you know too." His words settled into Margaret like a blessing, a validation she hadn't realized she needed. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't driven mad by grief. She was simply paying attention to things most people had forgotten how to see. December deepened and the cold intensified. By mid-month, temperatures were dropping below normal, not drastically but noticeably. The news mentioned it in passing, nothing to worry about, just a cold snap that would pass. But it didn't pass. It held, steady and unyielding, and then it began to drop further. Margaret watched her neighbors go about their normal routines, confident in their modern heating systems, in the reliability of electricity and natural gas, in the assumption that civilization's infrastructure would protect them from nature's harshness. They hung Christmas lights and planned parties and complained about the cold but didn't truly worry. Why would they? This was the 21st century. They had technology. They had systems. They were safe. But Margaret knew, with increasing certainty, that safety was an illusion that could shatter as easily as ice under pressure. She had learned that lesson when Thomas died, when the solid ground of her life had cracked open without warning. She wouldn't be caught unprepared again. She couldn't afford to be. On the evening of December 20th, the first major storm warning came through. Not on television, which still predicted just a winter storm, normal for the season, but from the National Weather Service in the form of a bulletin that made the local news anchors pause and read twice. A massive Arctic system was descending from Canada, bringing with it temperatures and conditions not seen in the region for over 50 years. The forecast called for sustained temperatures of 10 to 20 degrees below zero, with wind chills approaching 40 below. Heavy snowfall was expected, possibly measuring in feet rather than inches. Duration was uncertain, but potentially lasting a week or more. And there was a possibility, just a possibility, they stressed, of power outages if the system proved as severe as some models predicted. The town reacted with moderate concern. People went to stores, buying extra milk and bread, the traditional storm supplies that would do little good if power actually failed for an extended period. They checked their furnaces and made sure they had fuel. They brought in extra blankets and maybe some candles. Then they settled in to wait, confident that the storm would pass as storms always did. That life would return to normal in a day or two. That the warnings were probably overblown as weather warnings often were. Margaret didn't share their confidence. She made one final trip to the store, buying batteries and matches and a few last food items. She topped off the generator's fuel tank and made sure all the spare containers were full. She brought in extra water and filled the bathtubs in case pipes froze. She made sure Emily understood the plan. If power failed, they would stay in the main room downstairs, keeping it warm with the fireplace, conserving heat and fuel, staying together. "Is it going to be bad, Mama?" Emily asked that night as Margaret tucked her into bed, Copper already in position beside her. Margaret considered lying, offering false reassurance. But Emily deserved truth. She had already faced the death of her father. She could face this too, with honesty. "It might be," Margaret said carefully. "But we're ready. We've prepared. And no matter what happens, we'll take care of each other. Okay?" Emily nodded, her small face serious. "Daddy would be proud of you," she said softly, "for getting us ready." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "Thank you, baby. That means more than you know." She kissed Emily's forehead, scratched Copper's ears, and went downstairs to wait. Outside, the wind was beginning to rise, carrying the scent of snow and something else, something cold and ancient and unstoppable. The storm was coming, and Margaret, the widow they had mocked for pouring strange liquid into wood, was as ready as any human could be for what nature was about to unleash. The storm arrived on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, as if nature itself had chosen the moment for maximum symbolic impact. It came not gradually, but all at once, like a door slamming shut on the world. One moment there was wind and cold and the promise of snow. The next moment there was nothing but white chaos, a blizzard so complete and consuming that visibility dropped to zero within minutes. Margaret had been watching from the window when it hit. She had seen the wall of white approaching across the fields, moving with terrifying speed, and had called Emily downstairs immediately. They gathered in the main room where the fireplace was already burning, Copper between them, and waited as the storm engulfed their house. The wind hit first, a roar so loud it drowned out all other sound. It didn't gust and fade like normal wind. It sustained, a constant scream that rattled windows and found every tiny gap in the house's defenses. Then came the snow, not falling but flying horizontally, driven by wind that turned each flake into a tiny frozen projectile. The temperature plummeted, dropping 20 degrees in less than an hour, then continuing to fall. Within 2 hours, the power failed. Not just in Margaret's house, but across the entire town, as the grid collapsed under the weight of ice and the fury of wind. Transformers exploded in bright flashes that briefly illuminated the white darkness before dying. And suddenly, Riverside went from a modern town with all its conveniences to a collection of structures trying to hold back the ancient cold. In Margaret's house, the loss of power was inconvenient, but not catastrophic. She had prepared for this. She lit oil lamps she had ready, their warm glow pushing back the darkness. The fireplace continued to burn, fed by the wood she had so carefully treated and stacked. She had already moved supplies downstairs, anticipating they would need to stay in this one room to conserve heat. But in the neighboring houses, panic was beginning to set in. Modern heating systems went silent. Digital thermostats went dark. Families accustomed to controlling their environment with the touch of a button suddenly found themselves at the mercy of forces they didn't understand and couldn't control. Mrs. Patterson tried to use her decorative fireplace, but the chimney hadn't been cleaned in years, and smoke backed up into her living room, choking and stinging. She and her husband fled upstairs, sealing themselves in their bedroom with blankets. But the cold followed them, creeping through walls that were insulated for normal winters. Not for this. The young family down the street, the Johnsons, with 3 children under 10, huddled in their family room, burning what furniture they could safely break apart, trying desperately to keep their children warm. But their fireplace was small, designed more for ambiance than heating, and the wood burned too quickly, producing heat that seemed to vanish into the cold as fast as it was created. Mr. Chen closed his hardware store and tried to make it home, but his car died in the snow. He abandoned it and walked, fighting through drifts that were already waist-deep, arriving at his house with frostbite on his fingers and a terror he had never felt before. His gas furnace needed electricity to run its blower and controls. Without power, it was useless. He had a space heater that ran on propane, but it was in the garage, buried under boxes, and by the time he found it and got it working, he was shaking so hard he could barely hold the lighter. All across Riverside, similar scenes played out. People who had mocked Margaret's preparations were learning, with brutal speed, that their modern conveniences were fragile, that their assumptions about safety were built on systems that could fail, that winter without preparation was a killer. The temperature continued to drop. By midnight, it had reached 15 below zero. By 2 in the morning, 25 below. The wind didn't let up, the snow didn't stop, and the cold became a living thing, hunting for any weakness, any gap, any opening through which it could invade and destroy. Margaret kept the fire burning steadily, feeding it the wood she had treated with Thomas's grandfather's recipe. And as the hours passed, she began to notice something remarkable. The treated wood burned differently than normal firewood. It burned hotter, longer, with flames that seemed more intense and heat that radiated more powerfully. A single log lasted nearly twice as long as untreated wood, burning with a steady, sustained heat that filled the room. She realized, with growing understanding, what the treatment had done. The oils and resins had penetrated deep into the wood's structure, increasing its density, its energy content, its ability to produce and sustain heat. This wasn't just preservation. This was transformation. Thomas's grandfather had created a formula that turned ordinary firewood into something far more efficient, far more valuable, especially in conditions like these. Emily slept on the couch, wrapped in blankets, Copper curled against her for additional warmth. Margaret sat in a chair nearby, feeding the fire, checking temperatures, monitoring their supplies. The house creaked and groaned under the assault of wind and cold, but it held. The treated exterior wood, sealed and protected by the strange liquid, resisted the moisture and ice that would normally penetrate and damage. The windows, though frosted over completely, didn't leak air. The doors held firm. Margaret allowed herself a moment of gratitude for Thomas, for his knowledge, for the notebooks he had left behind. He was gone, but his wisdom remained, protecting his family even from beyond death. She touched the wedding ring she still wore and whispered, Thank you. You're still taking care of us. As dawn approached, though it was impossible to tell in the whiteout conditions, Margaret heard something over the roar of the wind. A sound like knocking, desperate and urgent. She moved to the window, wiping frost away, peering through the small clear patch she created. Through the swirling snow, she could barely make out shapes on her porch. People. Someone was at her door. She grabbed a heavy coat and fought the door open against the wind. 3 figures stumbled inside, coated in snow, shaking violently. It took Margaret a moment to recognize them. Mr. Chen and the Johnson family parents, carrying their youngest child who wasn't moving enough. "Please," Mrs. Johnson gasped, her lips blue with cold. "Please. We didn't know where else to go. Our house is freezing. The children—" Her voice broke. Margaret didn't hesitate. "Get inside, now. How many children do you have total?" 3. Mr. Johnson managed through chattering teeth. "The older 2 are still at home with my mother. We brought the baby because she stopped crying. We got scared." "Go back and get them," Margaret commanded. "All of them. Your mother too. It's not safe to separate. Mr. Chen, help them. Follow the fence line. Don't lose sight of it." They stumbled back out into the storm while Margaret quickly prepared. She moved furniture, created sleeping areas, brought out every blanket and sleeping bag she had stored. She increased the fire, using more wood than she had planned because she would need more heat for more people. She boiled water, knowing they would need warm liquids. Emily woke, taking in the scene with calm acceptance. "More people are coming?" "Yes, baby. We're going to help them." "Okay, Mama. What should I do?" "Get the extra blankets from upstairs, and your stuffed animals. The other children might need them." Emily nodded and headed upstairs with Copper following, the girl and dog working together as they always did. When Mr. Chen and the Johnsons returned with the other children and the elderly grandmother, Margaret set to work. She stripped them of wet outer layers, wrapped them in dry blankets, positioned them near the fire. The baby, barely 2 years old, was dangerously cold, not responding much. Margaret held her close to her own body, skin to skin under the blankets, slowly warming her with careful precision. Too fast could be as dangerous as not fast enough. The older children, 6 and 8, clung to their parents, eyes wide with fear and confusion. Emily approached them quietly, offering her stuffed rabbit to the younger one. "It's warm here," she said simply. "You're safe now." As the Johnsons slowly warmed and the immediate crisis passed, Margaret asked the question she needed to ask. "How many other houses are in trouble?" Mr. Chen, his frostbitten fingers wrapped in cloth, shook his head. "All of them. Everyone. The Pattersons are trying to stay in their bedroom, but it's getting colder. The Hendricks family has a fireplace, but I don't think they have much wood. The elderly couple at the end of the street, the Wangs, I don't think they can manage on their own." Margaret made a decision. "When there's a break in the wind, we'll need to bring them here, all of them. This house can hold more people than just us." Mrs. Johnson stared at her. "But we said terrible things about you. We laughed at you. We thought you were crazy." Margaret met her eyes steadily. "None of that matters now. What matters is keeping people alive. That's all that matters." The storm raged for 3 days. 3 days of unrelenting wind and snow and cold that tested every structure, every preparation, every assumption about safety. And during those 3 days, Margaret's house became a refuge. They came in groups, fighting through the snow during brief moments when the wind eased enough to see a few feet ahead. Mrs. Patterson and her husband, ashamed and grateful. The Hendricks family with their teenage sons. The elderly Wangs, barely able to walk through the drifts. A single mother from 2 streets over with her disabled daughter. A young couple who had just moved to town. Margaret took them all in. She organized sleeping areas, rationed supplies, established schedules for cooking and heating. She taught them how to conserve heat, how to layer clothing properly, how to recognize signs of hypothermia and frostbite. She shared what she had without complaint or judgment. The treated firewood proved its worth over and over. While other houses burned through their supplies desperately, trying to maintain heat, Margaret's wood burned long and hot, keeping the main room of her house warm enough for 23 people and 1 old dog to survive. The exterior treatment protected the house's structure, preventing the ice and moisture damage that was destroying other homes. Emily became a helper, entertaining the younger children, assisting with meal preparation, comforting those who were scared. Copper moved among the people like a therapy dog, offering warmth and presence to those who needed it most. The house that had been just Margaret, Emily, and Copper became a small community, bound together by necessity and the simple human need to survive. On the second night, as Margaret fed the fire and checked on sleeping families, Mrs. Patterson approached her quietly. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I said terrible things. I called you crazy. I tried to have the police come. I'm so ashamed." Margaret was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "You weren't wrong to be concerned," she finally said. "What I was doing looked strange. But strange and wrong aren't always the same thing." "How did you know?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "How did you know this was coming?" "I paid attention," Margaret said simply. "To the animals, to the sky, to the feeling in the air. And I remembered what my husband taught me about preparing for the worst." "The liquid you were using on the wood, what was it?" Margaret explained the recipe, the old formula passed down through Thomas's family. Mrs. Patterson listened with growing amazement. "And that's why your wood burns so much better?" "Yes, it's denser, more efficient. In normal winters, it wouldn't matter much. But in cold like this, it's the difference between adequate heat and not enough." Mrs. Patterson shook her head slowly. "We were so wrong about you. So completely wrong." "You didn't know," Margaret said. "None of you knew. But now you do. And if you survive this, you'll prepare differently next time." "If?" Mrs. Patterson's voice wavered. "When," Margaret corrected gently. "When you survive this, we're going to be okay. All of us." But she wasn't entirely sure of that. The wood was lasting better than normal, yes. But with 23 people to keep warm, supplies were being depleted faster than she had calculated for. Food was manageable. Everyone had brought what they could carry. But the firewood, even treated and efficient, had limits. If the storm lasted much longer, they would face hard choices. On the morning of the third day, the wind finally began to ease. The snow still fell, but the blizzard's fury was spent. People began to hope that the worst had passed, that they could return to their homes and begin recovery. But when Mr. Chen and Mr. Johnson ventured out to check conditions, they returned with grim news. The town was devastated. Snow had buried everything to the roof lines. Many structures had collapsed under the weight. Power lines were down everywhere, poles snapped like matchsticks. The roads were impassable, buried under drifts 15 feet high in places. And the cold remained brutal, 20 below zero with no sign of warming. They were trapped, cut off from help, and winter was far from over. Margaret gathered everyone in the main room that evening for a difficult conversation. "We need to talk about reality," she began. "The storm may have passed, but the danger hasn't. We're isolated here. Help won't reach us for days, maybe weeks. The cold is going to continue, and our supplies, while good, aren't infinite." Faces showed fear, but also determination. They had survived 3 days together. They could survive longer. "We need to pool everything we have," Margaret continued. "Food, fuel, supplies. We need to establish strict rationing. We need to send out teams to salvage wood from damaged structures, carefully and safely. We need to melt snow for water to preserve what we have stored. And we need to work together, because that's the only way we're going to make it through this." One of the teenage Hendricks boys raised his hand. "What about the other houses? Are there other people who didn't make it here?" The question hung heavy in the air. Margaret had wondered the same thing. "Tomorrow, when it's light, we'll do a careful search, check every house, bring anyone who needs help. But we have to be smart about it. The cold will kill you in minutes if you're not prepared." That night, Margaret lay awake long after everyone else had fallen asleep. She listened to the breathing of 23 people who were alive because she had prepared, because she had trusted her instincts, because she had refused to let mockery stop her from doing what she knew was right. She thought about Thomas, about how he had given her the knowledge to save not just herself and Emily, but an entire community. And she thought about the wood. treated with that strange liquid everyone had laughed at. Wood that was now literally keeping them alive, burning hot and long, providing heat that was the only thing standing between 23 people and the killing cold outside. The mockery seemed like a distant memory now, irrelevant and forgotten. What remained was the simple truth that preparation mattered, that old wisdom had value, that sometimes the things that seemed foolish were actually the wisest choices possible. Copper lifted his head and looked at Margaret, as if sensing her thoughts. She reached out and scratched his ears. "Good boy," she whispered. "You're doing great. Daddy would be proud of both of us." The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, then he settled back down, returning to his endless vigil. Outside, the temperature continued to drop, hitting 30 below zero. But inside Margaret's house, warmth persisted. Life persisted. Hope persisted. And the wood, treated with a strange liquid that had once been a source of mockery, burned on through the darkest, coldest night any of them would ever know. Dawn came late and reluctant on the fourth day, the sun struggling to penetrate clouds that hung heavy and gray over a transformed world. Margaret stood at the window, scraping frost from the inside of the glass, looking out at what had once been her neighborhood. It was barely recognizable. Snow had reshaped everything, turning familiar houses into strange white mounds, erasing roads and yards and the comfortable boundaries of normal life. Some structures had collapsed entirely under the weight of snow and ice. Others stood but looked damaged, roofs sagging, walls buckled. It was a landscape of survival and loss. She turned back to the crowded room where 23 people were beginning to wake, to stretch cramped muscles, to face another day in conditions none of them had imagined possible. Emily was already up, helping the younger Johnson child get dressed in layers. Copper moved among the waking people, tail wagging slowly, offering morning greetings that seemed to lift spirits despite everything. Margaret made her announcement over a breakfast of oatmeal stretched thin to feed everyone. "We need to search the neighborhood. There may be others who need help. We'll go in teams of 3. No one goes alone. You'll take rope to stay connected. You'll mark your path, and you'll be smart about exposure. 20 minutes outside maximum, then back to warm up. Understood?" The Hendricks teenagers volunteered immediately, eager to do something active after days of confinement. Mr. Johnson and Mr. Chen joined them. Mrs. Patterson surprisingly insisted on going too. "I know every house on this street," she said firmly. "I know who lives where, who might need special help. You need me." Margaret organized 4 search teams, equipping each with rope, emergency supplies, and strict instructions. Emily and the younger children stayed behind with the elderly Mrs. Wang, who was still too frail to handle the cold, but who could supervise and keep everyone calm. The first team left at full light, fighting through snow that in places came up to their waists. They moved slowly, methodically, checking each house. Some were empty, families having made it to Margaret's refuge already. Others held people who had survived but were in bad shape, hypothermic, frostbitten, traumatized by days alone in the brutal cold. Mrs. Patterson found the elderly Mr. Morrison in his house, barely conscious, his living room temperature below freezing. She and Mr. Chen carried him out between them, moving as quickly as the snow allowed, getting him back to Margaret's house where she immediately began the slow, careful warming process. The Hendricks boys discovered a family trapped in their basement, afraid to leave because their house's first floor had partially collapsed. They guided them out through a window well, carrying the smallest child, leading the parents who were in shock and could barely process what was happening. By mid-afternoon, they had found 17 more people. Margaret's house, already crowded, became packed to capacity. Every room was in use now, the fireplace supplemented by the wood stove from the kitchen, both burning the treated wood that continued to prove its worth. Space was tight. Privacy was non-existent. But everyone was warm. Everyone was alive. The rescued brought stories that painted a grim picture. Some had tried to survive in their modern homes and nearly died when heat ran out and cold invaded. Others had attempted to drive to safety and abandoned their vehicles in snow too deep to navigate. One man had tried to walk to the next town and had made it only 2 blocks before the cold forced him back. They spoke with the voices of people who had looked at death and barely escaped. Margaret listened to each story, noting what had worked and what hadn't, mentally cataloging information that might be needed. She was no longer just protecting her own family. She had become, without planning it, the leader of a community that had formed around her preparation and knowledge. That evening, as she inventoried remaining supplies by lamplight, Mr. Chen joined her. His frostbitten fingers were healing slowly, wrapped in clean cloth, no longer black but still painful. "We have a problem," he said quietly, not wanting to alarm the others. "Tell me," Margaret replied, her voice equally quiet. "The wood. Even with how efficient it burns, we're using it faster than I think you calculated. We have maybe 4 more days at this rate. After that—" He didn't finish the sentence. Margaret had known this was coming. She had done the math repeatedly. "We need to salvage more wood from damaged structures, carefully, taking only what's safe to remove. And I need to treat it." "Can you make more of that liquid?" Mr. Chen asked. "The treatment?" "Not enough. I used most of the ingredients I had, but—" Margaret paused, thinking. "We don't need to fully treat it. Even a partial treatment will help. A quick soak in what remains of the mixture. Let it penetrate for a few hours. It'll burn better than untreated wood, even if not as well as the wood I prepared properly." "How much wood can we salvage?" "Enough, if we're smart. The Hendersons' garage collapsed. That's lumber. The Peterson place lost its porch. More lumber. We're not stealing. These structures are already damaged beyond repair. We're salvaging what we can use." Mr. Chen nodded slowly. "I'll organize teams. We'll bring in whatever we can find safely." Over the next 3 days, salvage teams went out whenever weather permitted. They dismantled damaged structures carefully, bringing back boards, beams, anything that would burn. Margaret treated what she could with her remaining mixture, diluting it to stretch further. Wood that couldn't be treated got used first, saving the treated wood for when they needed maximum efficiency. The work was hard, dangerous, exhausting. But it gave people purpose. The teenage boys discovered they were stronger than they thought. The men learned to work together, setting aside previous differences. Even some of the women went out, including Mrs. Patterson, who proved surprisingly tough despite her age. Emily, watching her mother organize and lead, learned lessons no classroom could teach. She saw how Margaret made difficult decisions without hesitation, how she rationed fairly even when it meant she herself went with less, how she settled disputes calmly and kept spirits up when fear threatened to overwhelm. The girl was watching her mother become someone larger than life, someone people looked to for guidance and hope. On the 8th day, the temperature finally began to rise. Not dramatically, it only climbed to 0. But after days of 20 and 30 below, 0 felt almost warm. More importantly, the clouds began to break, allowing brief glimpses of blue sky. The oppressive weight of the storm was lifting. That afternoon, they heard a sound that brought everyone to tears. A helicopter. It appeared over the ridge to the south, flying low, searching. Margaret grabbed a bright orange tarp from her supplies and ran outside with Mr. Chen and the Hendricks boys. They spread it on the snow and weighted it down with rocks, creating a signal visible from the air. The helicopter circled, dipped lower, and a voice came over a loudspeaker. "Help is coming. Road crews are working to reach you. Hold on, you're going to be okay." The relief was overwhelming. People hugged each other, cried, laughed. They had survived. Against odds that had seemed impossible, through cold that had killed others in the region, they had survived. But help couldn't come immediately. The roads were still impassable. It took 4 more days before the first snowplows broke through, followed by emergency vehicles, National Guard trucks, and relief workers. When they arrived, they found a town devastated, but a community intact, gathered in and around one house that had become a beacon of survival. The emergency coordinator, a weathered woman named Captain Rodriguez, walked through Margaret's house with visible amazement. "How many people sheltered here?" 43 at the peak, Margaret replied. 17 are back in their own homes now, once we got those structures minimally habitable. "For 12 days?" "Yes, ma'am." Captain Rodriguez looked at the fireplace, still burning with treated wood. She looked at the organized supplies, the sleeping areas, the system that had kept 43 people alive. "I need to know how you did this. We have other communities still cut off. Anything you can tell us might save lives." Margaret spent the next hour explaining her preparation, the wood treatment, the techniques she had used. Captain Rodriguez took notes rapidly, already thinking about how to disseminate this information. This recipe, your husband's grandfather's formula. Would you be willing to share it? Of course, Margaret said without hesitation. That's exactly what Thomas would have wanted. Knowledge like this is meant to be shared, not hoarded. As professional help took over, as people were evacuated for medical treatment or to stay with relatives elsewhere, as the town slowly began the long process of recovery, Margaret finally had time to sit down, to rest, to process what had happened. She found herself on her porch on the 13th day, wrapped in a coat, watching volunteers work to clear roads and deliver supplies. Emily came out to join her, sitting close, copper settling at their feet. "Mama, are we heroes?" Emily asked. Margaret considered the question carefully. "No, baby, we're not heroes. We just did what needed to be done. Heroes are people who do extraordinary things. We just prepared, and then we shared what we had. But you saved everyone. I had the knowledge and the supplies to help. That's different from being a hero. Your father, he's the real hero. He left us the knowledge that made all this possible." Emily was quiet for a moment. "People keep thanking you. They keep saying they're sorry for how they treated you before." "I know. Does it make you feel good? That they finally know you were right?" Margaret thought about this, about the mockery she had endured, about the vindication she could have claimed, but that wasn't what she felt. "It makes me feel sad," she said finally, "because some of what I was right about came from losing your father. I would give anything to have him back, to have never needed this knowledge. But we did need it. And because we had it, everyone lived." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "Yes, that's true. And that matters. It matters a lot." In the weeks that followed, as Riverside slowly recovered, Margaret's story spread. News crews came, wanting to interview the widow who had saved her neighborhood. Scientists wanted to analyze her wood treatment. Survival experts wanted to include her methods in their teaching. She became, briefly, famous in a way she neither sought nor particularly wanted. But more importantly, she became a teacher. She held classes in the community center once it was rebuilt, teaching people about preparation, about reading nature's signs, about the old techniques that modern life had forgotten. She shared Thomas's grandfather's recipe freely, posting it online, demonstrating the process, encouraging people to learn and adapt it. Mr. Chen's hardware store, once rebuilt, began stocking the ingredients for the wood treatment, along with other survival supplies. Mrs. Patterson started a community preparedness group, her own shame transformed into motivation to help others learn. The Hendricks boys went on to study emergency management in college, inspired by what they had witnessed. The Johnson children, young as they were, never forgot the lessons about resilience and community they had learned in Margaret's crowded house. Emily grew up in a town that had changed fundamentally. Where there had been mockery of preparation, there was now respect. Where there had been assumption of safety through modern systems, there was now understanding that those systems could fail. Where there had been isolation between neighbors, there was now connection forged in survival's crucible. Years later, when Emily was grown and had children of her own, she would take them to visit their grandmother. Margaret, older now but still strong, still sharp, still maintaining her preparedness, would tell her grandchildren the story, not as a tale of her own wisdom, but as a story about listening to the land, about honoring knowledge passed down through generations, about the importance of preparation and community. And she would show them the wood treatment recipe, written in Thomas's careful handwriting, preserved in a frame on the wall. "This saved 43 lives," she would tell them. Not because it was magic, because it was knowledge, applied at the right time, shared freely when it was needed. That's what your great-grandfather gave us. That's what we try to give forward. The strange liquid that had once been a source of mockery became part of local legend, then part of standard emergency preparation throughout the region. Other communities adopted the formula or variations of it. Survival experts studied why it worked, creating modern versions with similar properties. But the original recipe, handwritten in a logger's notebook, remained the most valued version, passed from person to person, family to family, a link to knowledge that had saved lives. Margaret lived to see the town rebuild, to see it prepare better for future emergencies. to see the culture shift from complacency to readiness. She saw Mr. Morrison, the elderly man she had helped save, live another 12 years and die peacefully in his sleep. She saw the Johnson children grow up healthy and strong. She saw Mrs. Patterson become one of the most vocal advocates for emergency preparedness in the entire state. And she saw Emily become the kind of woman Thomas would have been proud of. Strong, capable, wise, and compassionate. A woman who had learned from her mother that sometimes being right means being mocked, but that doing what's right matters more than being comfortable, more than being accepted, more than anything except keeping your loved ones safe. On winter evenings, when snow fell soft and beautiful rather than deadly, Margaret would sit by her fireplace, still burning wood treated with the same recipe, though she no longer needed to hoard it, with Copper's successor, a young dog Emily had given her, and she would think about that terrible winter. She would think about the people gathered in her house, about the children who had been saved, about the community that had been forged, and she would think about Thomas, about his love of the old ways, about his respect for knowledge passed through generations, about how he had never known that his careful notes would save dozens of lives. She would touch her wedding ring, worn smooth with years, and whisper, "We did it, love. We kept them safe. Your knowledge kept them safe." The fire would crackle, warming the room, burning with the efficiency that only treated wood could achieve. Outside, winter would be just winter. Beautiful, cold, manageable. Inside, warmth and safety were maintained not by luck or by systems that could fail, but by preparation, by knowledge, by the understanding that respecting the power of nature meant learning to work with it, rather than assuming you could ignore it. The widow they had mocked had become the woman who saved them. The strange liquid they had laughed at had become the thing that kept them alive. And the lesson, learned in the harshest classroom nature could provide, had transformed an entire community. Margaret was no hero, as she had told Emily. She was simply a woman who listened when others didn't, who prepared when others mocked, who shared when others needed. But in being simply that, she had accomplished something extraordinary. She had taken grief and loss and turned them into survival and hope. She had taken knowledge from the past and made it relevant for the present. She had taken a community divided by judgment and united it through shared survival. As she sat by her fire on that peaceful winter evening, Margaret felt no vindication, no pride, no satisfaction at having been proven right. She felt only gratitude, for Thomas and the knowledge he had left, for Emily and the strength she had shown, for Copper and his unwavering loyalty, for the community that had emerged from crisis stronger and more connected. And she felt peace. The peace that comes from knowing you did everything you could, from knowing that when the worst came, you were ready, from knowing that the people you love are safe not by accident, but by preparation. The wood burned on, treated with a strange liquid that had once been a joke, now a testament to the power of old wisdom, careful preparation, and the unshakable determination of one widow who refused to let mockery stop her from protecting her family, and, ultimately, her entire community. Winter came and went, year after year, but never again with the fury of that terrible season. And never again did the people of Riverside mock those who prepared, who listened to the land, who honored the knowledge of those who came before. Because they had learned, in the coldest and hardest way possible, that sometimes the things that seem strangest are actually the wisest. That sometimes the people who are mocked are actually the ones who see most clearly. And that sometimes survival comes down to one person who was willing to do what others thought was foolish, because she knew, with the certainty that comes from love and loss and hard-won wisdom, that it was necessary. Margaret had poured strange liquid into wood while her neighbors laughed. And when winter came with all its fury, that strange liquid, that mocked preparation, that dismissed wisdom, became the thing that saved them all. That was the story. That was the lesson. And that was the legacy of a widow who trusted herself, honored her husband's memory, and refused to let judgment stop her from doing what needed to be done. The fire burned warm. The house stood strong. And the people of Riverside remembered always the winter when they learned that preparation matters, that old knowledge has value, and that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is actually the one who saves everyone else.